Welcome, welcome, welcome. Yes, my friends, this is the Vintage Edmonton Music Podcast, and I am your host, Rob Recluse, and welcome to podcast number 5, the Gala podcast number 5. And the band that I'm going to spotlight today is a really good one for me. I've wanted to do this since the Vintage Edmonton podcast uh, gave birth, essentially. This is one of those bands in Edmonton lore that had quite a long career, a varied career again, like a lot of the other bands and other artists that I'm going to spotlight on the podcast. This is the band called One Horse Blue that originally came out in the late 70s, mid-late 70s, had a very hybrid country rock sound to it that was not unlike a rockier version of the Eagles or Poco, which the band got its name from. And after one record or one album of that kind of hybrid, they made a couple of more records that were more straight ahead rock and roll than they were country. Broke up afterwards, reformed a few years later in the late 80s, early 90s, and were pretty much a straight country band. I guess it would be on the urban country or the country rock side of the equation, but they were more country than they were rock. So they had a very interesting career through the 70s and the 80s and the early 90s. And the album that I'm going to spotlight, and the 45 that I'm going to spotlight for today's podcast, is the very first album, called One Horse Blue, and the single that was released just before the album called One Horse Blue also, which again is a Poco song written by Paul Cotton, a very straight ahead rock and roll song for Poco, a lot harder than they would usually do. And I've got the 45 here. I really like this version. I actually got the 45 before I ever got the album, not knowing who the band was and not knowing the history. Produced by Wes Dacus, the legendary Wes Dacus. Obviously, the leader of the Lords, producing and writing and managing throughout the years of the 60s, 70s, and 80s and 90s. A legendary figure in Edmonton music. He had a big hand in One Horse Blue, and especially on this album also. So the song that I'm going to play for you was the 45 that I picked up before I ever heard of the band itself. And this is the A side, which is One Horse Blue, the Paul Cotton Poco song. They do it a very faithful version of it, very hard rocking version of it. Then they kind of veer into a reprise of the song, but a little bit different. It sounds to my ears anyway, almost Brian Wilson-esque, very Beach Boys like, with a beautiful string section that ends the song. Very interesting for 1978 when it was released. So this is the A side on Veracruz Records from 1978, One Horse Blue, with the song called One Horse Blue, here on the Vintage Edmonton Music Podcast.
With a traveling heart, watches me run. Yeah! Though it's true, I'm living with a traveling heart. It was yours, you knew from the very start. I've come to know your rise and high, lost in the time that slowly cries. Come on, ride it. Come on, ride it.
Welcome back to the Vintage Edmonton Music Podcast. That was One Horse Blue with the title track of the album and the title of the 45. They both came out in 1978 on Veracruz Records. And the one I'm going to play for you now is actually the B-side of this, called Love Like a Fire, that was written by the drummer Ron, and I'm going to slaughter this name, so Ron, I apologize. I'm going to give it a shot, and hopefully it'll come out right. It was written by Ron Vaujois. Ron, if you're out there, I apologize. Sorry about that. Send me the hate mail. Yeah. It was written by Ron and Mavis McCauley, which is a name that's going to be coming up on future Vintage Edmonton Music podcasts, also as a solo artist and having her hand with a lot of different things. She co-wrote this song, actually played on the album as well. And it's a very of its time country rock, kind of a country rock hybrid, very Eagles-esque before Hotel California, but along those same lines, very much of its time also. So this is One Horse Blue with the B-side of the One Horse Blue A-side. This is a song called Love Like a Fire here on the Vintage Edmonton Music Podcast.
Been fooling ourselves, can't you realize it's gone? You should know, no. Love like a fire, you've been out for a long time. Love like a fire, kept me warm, giving you time to realize it's over. Don't come around. Don't you know that you're talking to a bare lonely wall? Can't you see love light's long been out. Don't you feel like you're standing in a cold, empty room? Don't you know? Don't you know? Love like a fire, you've been out for a long time. Love like a fire kept me warm. Think it's time to realize it's over. Don't come around anymore. I've been trying to explain my love for you's gone. You keep trying to let me know my feelings are all wrong. This love affair ain't done. It's been dead for a long, long time. Love like a fire. Love like a fire.
Welcome back to the Vintage Edmonton Music Podcast. That was One Horse Blue with a song called Love Like a Fire, which is the B-side of the original 45 on Veracruz Records, with the A-side, obviously, of the title track and the name of the band, One Horse Blue. So I'm going to put in a couple more songs here off the One Horse Blue proper LP, both songs by guitar player Michael Shillard. And the first I want to play for you is a song called Cry Out for the Sun, which is a very hard-rocking, country-tinged rock song, which really shows the band, I think, at its best. Very hard-rocking, again, but again, it's got that little bit of a twang to it that really is appealing, and the songwriting also by Michael Shillard is just very, very good. Very, very solid writing. I really like this album. Out of all of them, I think this is my favorite album. This might be my favorite song off the album. So this is One Horse Blue from 1978, recorded at Sundown Recording Studios by Wes Dacus, obviously, and Howard Steele. So this is the song called Cry Out for the Sun, written by Michael Shillard here on the Vintage Edmonton Music Podcast. Welcome back to the Vintage Edmonton Music Podcast. That was One Horse Blue with a song called Cry Out for the Sun, which reached number 68 on the Canadian charts in 1978. Now, the song I'm going to play for you now is a song called Black Time, also written by Michael Shillard. Probably the most Poco-esque song, I think, off the album, at least. Again, Poco's harder rocking songs, especially the ones written by Paul Cotton. This is a very enjoyable song. It kind of gives the best representation of the band, of the way it could go either country or go rock and roll, depending on what audience they were playing to, or how they felt at any particular moment. This is a really nice song for them. This is a song called Black Time by the band One Horse Blue here on the Vintage Edmonton Music Podcast.
There ain't no coming down from the black time. There ain't no in between for the last time. Loser keeps a moving, never ends. Loser never ends at all. He keeps a moving, he never ends. He's just a movement. God don't need to say goodbye. It makes no difference when I die. I got no reason. Yeah, I got no reason. Yeah, I got no reason. Shine tomorrow. I hope to see the sun shine tomorrow. I hope to see the sun shine tomorrow. I hope to see the sun shine on.
Welcome back to the Vintage Edmonton Music Podcast. That was One Horse Blue with a song called Black Time off the One Horse Blue album from 1978. One Horse Blue, the band, with Ian Oscar on vocals and guitar, Winston Quetch on guitars, Bob Burkhalter on pedal steel guitar, Michael Shillard on vocals and guitar, Randy Lloyd on vocals and bass guitar, and again, Ron, I apologize. Send me all the hate mail. I deserve it. Ron Vergois on vocals and drums. That was One Horse Blue. And this will not be the only podcast devoted to One Horse Blue. I'm gonna have a couple of podcasts in the future coming up on a couple of their later albums on the Veracruz records. This is again one of my favorite bands in vintage Edmonton music history, and we'll be delving into them a little bit. So I hope you enjoy that. I hope you enjoyed this podcast with them. So what am I gonna have coming up for next week or the next podcast, number 6? I have an immense amount of vintage Edmonton and vintage Central Alberta and vintage Alberta 45 one-shots 45s that came out between the 60s and the 80s by artists that are pretty much vanished. They made their records, put out the one record that they wanted to put out, 145 they wanted to put out, and then kind of disappeared back into their regular life or their obscurity or welcomed obscurity, whatever. I have a lot of these types of 45s, especially that came out between, and this particular one, 1975 and 1985. So I'm going to be playing a couple of those 45s. The first one that came out in 77 was a gentleman by the name of Jerry Charles. Very interesting guy. Just nothing on the web about him. So we'll be playing a couple of his songs on his 45. So 1977. And the other person I'm going to spotlight is a woman, an artist called Ursula. Not much. She put out an EP in 1983. Not much is about her again on the internet. So if anybody knows anything about Ursula, please send it along to the Vintage Edmonton Music Podcast. So these are the 45s I'm going to be spotlighting on podcast number 6. Again, should be out in about 2-3 weeks, give or take a week. So until next time, I'll see you later.